It started like any other high-profile congressional oversight hearing. Buzzing cameras, reporters lining the walls, and a tight-lipped crowd packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see whether the day would be more fireworks or political theater. No one expected what Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver, a full-blown courtroom earthquake. Brett Kavanaugh, polished and perched behind the microphone, looked his usual composed self. That is, until Representative Crockett took her seat. Known for her sharp tongue and even sharper research, Crockett had already made a name for herself as a fierce cross-examiner who didn't back down from power, no matter how high the perch. She cleared her throat, leaned into the mic, and locked eyes with the man whose Supreme Court confirmation had once ignited a cultural firestorm. Judge Kavanaugh, she began, her tone firm but surgical, you've spent years making decisions that have reshaped this country. You've spoken at length about integrity and impartiality. Today, I'm going to ask you some very specific questions, questions that strike at the very heart of your credibility. The room stiffened. Even the seasoned journalists seemed to brace themselves. Crockett reached down and retrieved a manila folder, thick and tabbed. She flipped it open and held up a page. Let's start with these email records, dated 2003, during your time as staff secretary in the Bush White House. Do you recognize this email address? She asked, displaying it clearly on the screen behind her. It belongs to Manuel Miranda, a Republican Senate aide later exposed for stealing confidential memos from Democratic staffers. Kavanaugh frowned slightly. I'm familiar with Mr. Miranda, but I don't recall any such email. Of course, Crockett replied, not missing a beat. Memory can be a funny thing. But these emails suggest you not only received the memos, knowing full well they were stolen, but you participated in strategy discussions based on them. In legal terms, that's not just unethical, it's complicity. Gasps spread through the chamber like a wildfire. One reporter's pen froze mid-scribble. Crockett was just warming up. And for the record, she added, tapping the binder, these emails have been verified by independent analysts and a bipartisan panel. So I want to be crystal clear here. Did you knowingly use illegally obtained materials to shape judicial nomination strategies? Kavanaugh shifted in his seat. Congresswoman, I would never. I didn't ask what you would never do, Crockett interrupted, her voice rising slightly. I asked what you did. And the documentation suggests you did exactly that. A murmur traveled across the chamber, quickly hushed by the presiding judge's gavel. Crockett flipped to the next section of her folder with precision, like a chess player lining up her next move. Now let's talk about finances. Specifically, the debt records and financial disclosures leading up to your 2006 federal bench confirmation. According to public records, Judge Kavanaugh, you carried between $60,000 and $200,000 in credit card debt and personal loans, yet by the time your confirmation rolled around, those debts mysteriously vanished. Kavanaugh tried to respond, but Crockett steamrolled ahead. Let's be clear, wiping that kind of debt clean is no small feat. There were no corresponding disclosures showing you sold property. No large income spike. No inheritance. What we do have, however, is a record of unexplained gifts from individuals later tied to conservative political networks. Silence fell so thick, you could hear chairs creak and phones click from trembling fingers trying to capture the moment. Kavanaugh's team shifted nervously behind him, passing notes back and forth. And while we're on the topic of gifts, she continued, let's talk about your private trips to resorts in Montana and Maine. Multiple trips, first-class airfare, luxury accommodations, none of which were ever disclosed in your financial filings. Coincidentally, these trips were hosted by members of organizations that later filed amicus briefs in cases before the court. Kavanaugh looked visibly uncomfortable now, his posture stiffening, jaw tightening. Crockett paused and leaned forward, dropping her voice to just above a whisper, forcing the room to quiet further to hear her. You've had the privilege of making decisions that affect millions of Americans. But when it comes to your own record, there's a pattern of secrecy, of evasion, and of entitlement. And I believe the American people deserve better. The courtroom was utterly still, as if time had frozen. Even the presiding judge looked rattled, glancing between Kavanaugh and Crockett with the weight of disbelief. The moment was heavy, not just for what it revealed about one man, but for what it exposed about the systems that had allowed him to rise. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She calmly closed the binder in front of her and looked straight at Kavanaugh. "This isn't about politics," she said. "This is about trust, and whether the highest court in our land can be trusted at all." The silence that followed was not empty, it was explosive. The following morning, the atmosphere outside the Capitol complex felt less like the usual media frenzy and more like the aftermath of a thunderstorm, charged, unsettled, and waiting for the next lightning strike. The hearing room, which had overflowed the day before, was now lined with new faces, legal scholars, Supreme Court watchers, and even a few members of the Judicial Ethics Committee. Jasmine Crockett had turned the spotlight into a blazing firestorm, and everyone wanted to know, was Brett Kavanaugh going to survive the heat? When Crockett entered, she looked more composed than ever, dressed sharply, her notes organized with color-coded tabs. Brett Kavanaugh, on the other hand, looked noticeably different from the day before. The smugness had vanished, replaced by a haunted stare and the tightly folded hands of a man realizing the ground beneath him was no longer solid. The chair banged the gavel. "Ms. Crockett, you may proceed." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she replied, rising and walking slowly to the center, turning her attention back to the man in question. "Yesterday, we discussed Judge Kavanaugh's involvement in the appropriation of stolen memos and undisclosed financial relationships. Today, I want to address the broader implications of those behaviors, specifically, how they may have tainted the integrity of decisions rendered by this Supreme Court." She gestured to the large screen behind her, which now displayed a list of cases decided by the court over the last 5 years. Each one highlighted in red had a common link: amicus briefs filed by organizations financially or personally connected to the undisclosed gifts received by Kavanaugh. For example, she continued, pointing to the screen, in case versus Federal Election Commission. One of the key briefs supporting the outcome was filed by an organization whose executive director hosted you at a private golf resort in Montana, an event never reported in your financial disclosures. Crockett turned, pacing slightly. "Judge Kavanaugh, let me be blunt. If a lower court judge failed to disclose gifts or personal ties to parties involved in cases they later ruled on, they'd be sanctioned or removed. But here you sit, untouched." "Why?" Kavanaugh swallowed, then leaned forward toward the mic. "Congresswoman, I believe I've complied with all relevant ethical guidelines, and I take disclosure." "Seriously?" Crockett's eyebrows lifted. "Seriously, because your track record suggests otherwise. In fact," she said, lifting another document, "your own clerks raised concerns in internal communications about whether these trips needed to be disclosed. Those warnings were ignored." Another ripple passed through the crowd. Crockett paused, letting the weight of that moment hang. "And let's not forget your refusal to recuse yourself from American Values vs. HHS, a case involving an organization that contributed to your confirmation PR campaign. That's not just bad optics, that's textbook conflict of interest." At that point, the presiding judge interjected, his voice unsteady. "Representative Crockett, we must remind all parties that this is not a criminal proceeding." Crockett didn't miss a beat. "With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, I'm not accusing Judge Kavanaugh of a crime, yet. I'm asking whether he can still be trusted to make impartial decisions from the bench when his past is riddled with secrets, favors, and strategic silence." Reporters were typing feverishly. Across the country, news networks were cutting in with live coverage. Hashtags like #Kavanaugh conflict and #Crockett crusade were climbing to the top of social media platforms. Then came Crockett's final blow. She walked back to her seat and pulled a single page from her folder. It was an affidavit, signed and notarized, by a former staffer in the Bush White House who claimed that Kavanaugh not only knew the memos were stolen but celebrated their use in manipulating judicial appointments. "This affidavit," she said, holding it high, "confirms that you were not a passive recipient. You were an active participant in one of the most ethically compromised periods of judicial planning in modern political history." The room went absolutely still. Kavanaugh didn't speak. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He looked down. He didn't even attempt to deny it. Crockett placed the document on the table and looked out at the room, not just at Kavanaugh, but at every lawmaker and judge watching. If we allow this to slide, if we pretend this is just another partisan battle, we're saying that the highest court in our nation is beyond accountability. That privilege shields truth. That power erases responsibility. She paused, her voice steady but filled with conviction. I refuse to accept that. And I believe the American people won't either. With that, she gathered her things and stepped away from the microphone. The hearing was adjourned minutes later, not because it had ended, but because the room had nothing left to say. Outside, reporters swarmed. Inside, the legacy of Brett Kavanaugh, and perhaps the credibility of the court itself, was left hanging by a thread. Jasmine Crockett had not just exposed a man. She had cracked open the very system that protected him. And the silence that followed was the sound of truth settling in.